Greetings, Dr. Bobby Price, your plant-based pharmacist and nutritionist, also author of Education Over Medication, helping you live longer, better, and happier. Many of you have probably heard a lot about some of the recent drug calls that have happened. There's been a lot of recalls with high blood pressure medications. There have been over actually 75 since 2016 of recalls for blood pressure medications. There's also been a recent recall of Zantac, ranitidine, which is a heartburn medication, or acid reflux, GERD, whatever you know about. And so I did a recent video about that, and I talked about why the drugs were recalled as it was related to a contaminant, a cancer-causing contaminant at that. And also one of the things that both drugs had in common, or all the recalls had in common, and sort of in correlation, is that they were all, for the majority's sake, made overseas in China and India. And so today I want to talk about sort of that impact, not only on, high blood pressure and, acid reflux medications, but on our entire drug supply, and specifically related to generic and brand drugs. So I think what I'll do is start by kind of reeling all the way back. And what we'll do is look at sort of how the FDA was formed, and then what were the initial intentions, or what was the primary purpose, and then how do we get into sort of all the scandals that we have going on today and our drug supply. So the FDA was formed in 1906. It was the Pure Food and Drug Act. So that was the initial formation of the FDA, but it wasn't really what we know it as today. What we know it as today really didn't develop until about 1938, where they created another act, which was the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And that act, what it did was put in sort of a lot of safety measures for us. So there were a lot of companies making foods, drugs out there that were actually killing people. So I think there was like a cough syrup that might have had some arsenic in it back in the days, in the 30s and the 20s. There was also an elixir called sulfanilamide that killed about 100 people. And so people started galvanizing together to try to figure out what they could do about all of these people creating these products that were actually causing a lot of harm to people. So in comes what we know as the FDA today. And primarily what the focus then was, the focus on safety. Is the product safe for consumption? Again, food and drugs. And so that was the primary focus then. And then what happens is, as we start to fast forward, the FDA actually gets a little bit more stringent in its regulations, because in the 1960s, there was one of the senior deputies, her name was, I think it was Frances Kelsey. There was a drug called thalidomide that drug companies were trying to actually get approved. And she was staunch against the drug, even though it was being used in Europe. And later on, what they found out was that drug thalidomide causes birth defects. It causes these web-like arms and hands on babies. And so the FDA dodged the bullet in that case. And at that time, the FDA started to be looked at like a hero for saving us from that bullet, or dodging that bullet. But as you start to fast forward, what you start to see is now all these drug companies begin to develop their drugs. And this is how developing a drug works, to kind of give you an idea. So you start with what's called an IND, an investigative new drug application. So that's just putting in the application. And then once that application is approved, you have to go through phase 1, 2, and 3, okay? Phase 1 is pretty much the process where they go through and they look at the safety. Is it safe? Phase 2 is pretty much the same thing. They're still looking at safety, they're monitoring safety, but now they're looking at efficacy. And then phase 3, once you go through phase 3 and get approved, you basically have an approved drug at that point. Now that process can take up to 10 years, a full decade. And in addition to that, that entire process can cost you like $1 billion. The clinical trials, the phase 1, 2, and 3, going from an IND application, all of that could cost you $1 billion. So at this time, you know, it was only brand name drugs making, you know, the vast majority of drugs in the American market. The only generics you really saw at that point were like really, really old drugs. So a drug like warfarin or Coumadin, which was really old, that had already went off patent. That drug will have a generic created for it because now it's not on patent. And that's pretty much how drugs work with the FDA. To have a therapy or something that's considered a therapy, it has to have a patent to it. You can only prescribe patented drugs, okay? And so if it doesn't have a patent at that point, or it has never had a patent, then it's not FDA approved. So back to the original point. So you have all these brand name drugs who are making drugs in the market, and drugs is slow to come to the market. So you have a lot of conditions that drug companies are trying to get drugs approved for, but it's a very slow process, as I said before. And so in 1984, they came up with the Hatch-Waxman Act. And the Hatch-Waxman Act was basically this regulation or new act that said that if you were a generic drug company, you could bring your drug to the market and you didn't have to prove that it had safety and efficacy. What you needed to prove is if it's a generic and it uses the same active component or active drug component in it, you need to show that the bioavailability is still equivalent to the brand drug. So it has the same bioavailability, meaning it absorbs in the body at the same rate, okay? And so that was the new act. The act also did this for the generic drug companies. It gave them an incentive. It said that for 6 months, you will have 6 months of exclusivity, meaning when you bring your drug to the market for 6 months, no other generic drug company could sort of be a competitor at that time. And how they worked was it was a first to file. And when I say first to file, like to the minute and to the second, like when they stamp your application, the first to file, to the minute, to the second, who got approved, that means that boom, you were on the market and you could have your drug on the market. It's exclusive for 6 months. And just to give you some bearing for the impact of that, because it seems like that's not a lot of time, but a drug like the generic for Lipitor, that drug made $600 million in 6 months. So that 6 months is very valuable. So just keep that in mind. And so they come up with this, this new act, and now you have all of these drug companies that are not only domestic in America, but that are abroad. See, the thing was, prior to that act, there were plenty of generic drug companies all over the world, especially in places like India. And so we didn't have any real generic companies here in America. And so this really opened up the floodgates. It turned the FDA into a local domestic agency into a international agency almost by overnight. And what you have to understand about the FDA is that they've always been underfunded, had a lack of resources, and had a lack of authority. Because the FDA doesn't have a seat in the House. Like they don't have a seat at the chair, at the executive chair. So they have to report to HHS, which is the Human Health Services. So they've never had the authority, the true authority that we believe that they have. And so what happens is you open up these floodgates, and now people are like putting in all these massive applications into the FDA. And the reason why is because in America, we have the largest market for people who buy drugs in comparison to other countries. So of course, every drug company outside of America wants to be approved by the FDA, you know? And so this sort of created a huge scandal and chaos. And what I mean by that is you would literally in the 80s have, you know, executives from drug companies lined up outside overnight, camped out in limos, and waiting for the doors to open so that they can rush to the door and file their application first to file, to the second, to the minute, to the second. And so there were times where you would see CEOs getting in fist fights. There was a huge scandal in the 90s where a local drug company, Mylan, in West Virginia, actually did a private investigation because they saw that all of these foreign generic drug companies were getting approved, but their company wasn't. And so they did a private investigation, and they actually discovered that these foreign companies were paying off FDA deputies and investigators to approve the drugs. And so this created a huge scandal. It was in the news. And for a long time, pretty much in America, generic drugs were seen as like counterfeit. So nobody really used generic drugs. But what happened was in 2003, there was George Bush. He created this PEPFAR. PEPFAR was the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. So during that time, Africa was going through a quote unquote AIDS crisis. And so George Bush was creating this relief plan to actually buy generic AIDS drugs to send over to Africa to help with the quote unquote crisis. And so the FDA decided that what it would do was expedite the drug approval process for companies in like India, China, and other places that would actually expedite their application if they had these drugs, so that they can then buy these drugs from these generic drug companies and then send them over to Africa. To kind of give you an idea, to buy the generic drug, you would spend like $1 a day to treat an AIDS patient. So the FDA puts this together, and then now you have all these drug companies being flooded in here. And so, you know, it was sort of created out of this quote unquote good Samaritan sort of thing. And it just led to chaos. And what I mean by that is this. So you hear that, you know, America is now buying drugs to send over to Africa, and the FDA is approving these drug companies in foreign places. And one of those companies I'll talk about, which was Ranbaxy. And so now Americans are trying to figure out, because there's so much, like drugs cost so much here in comparison to other places, that now Americans and Congress is trying to figure out, well, why can't we get some of those generic drugs over here and save taxpayers' dollars? And so what happens is Ranbaxy gets approved, and then they go with this 2003 PEPFAR, sort of, program that was put together. Now generic companies are being approved left and right, and one of them was Ranbaxy. And so the story I'm gonna use Ranbaxy as an example, but know that Ranbaxy is just one of the many generic drug companies that was out there. And so as Ranbaxy, which is located in India near Mumbai, gets approved for certain drugs, specifically to feed this PEPFAR program, they recruit certain senior executives from Bristol Myers Squibb, which is in New Jersey. They have an office in New Jersey. And the senior executive recruits one of the local engineers from Bristol Myers Squibb. His name is Dinesh Tucker. You can look all this up. And so they end up going over to India. And what you have to understand about drug companies or pharmaceutical companies in America, it's like you can walk in a drug company and everything is like pristine. You can eat off the floor. And so just keep in mind, that's the environment that they're coming from. They're coming from an environment where everything is heavily regulated, everything has standard operational procedures, everything is very checks and balances. and people have that understanding. And so they go over to India, and very soon after they arrive, the senior executive who recruited Dinesh Tucker resigns begrudgingly. And so he never tells Dinesh why he resigns, but he leaves. And so they recruit another executive from, I believe it was the London office. His name is Raj Kumar, to take his place. And very soon after Raj Kumar gets there, he gets a tip from the World Health Organization telling them that they did a site visit on a CRO, which is a contract research organization. And basically what a contract research organization does is they take data that a potential drug company has, and then they do the research for you, okay? And so like clinical trials, doing things like blood work, those sorts of things. And so the World Health Organization contacts Kumar, now at Ranbaxy, and tells him that they have discovered that a lot of the data that this CRO has created is actually falsified data. And it's not only just falsified data, meaning it means that they actually had no patients, they had no blood work, and so all of the data that they were giving to Ranbaxy was totally false. And so initially Kumar doesn't know what's going on because he's never been in this sort of situation. So he goes to Dinesh Tucker and tells him to do a private investigation of all the drug applications that Ranbaxy has put out since the 1980s, right? And so he does the investigation, and he finds that over 200 of the applications have falsified data. He also finds that not only is it over 200 applications, but it's spread out over 40 countries, okay? And so once they get all this information together, they decide to compile it together and put it in the form of a PowerPoint. And the PowerPoint was named the SAR PowerPoint, right? Assessment, SAR assessment, right? And they do, it's 24 slides. And they basically do a PowerPoint presentation for all of the executives at Ranbaxy. And after the PowerPoint is over, and basically what the PowerPoint says is, as a company, Ranbaxy has falsified on basically every drug application that they put in. All of the data is either wrong or it is false. And at the end of the PowerPoint, one of the executives says, "Can we cover it up?" And so at this point, Kumar realizes that this isn't the contract research organization's issue, but it is a company-wide issue at this point. And so no sooner than later, Raj Kumar, the executive, he also resigns. And then so at this point, they're trying to figure out how to cover up all this data. And at the same time, Dinesh is in this sort of peculiar spot, and he's saying that we need to report this to the FDA immediately and every other country that we send drugs to. And so no sooner than later, this is the very odd point, they fired Dinesh, and they fired him because they said that they went into his history on his websites and they found the use of porn, and that's why they fired him. And so for a couple of months, Dinesh is trying to figure out what he's going to do about this situation. And eventually what he does is he sends an anonymous email to the FDA letting them know that, hey, Ranbaxy is falsifying all this information on their drug applications, and he gets nothing. But he sends emails repeatedly, and eventually somebody responds to him, and they ask him, does he have a copy of the SAR, the report? And when they respond and ask him that, he asks, does he need a lawyer at that point? He eventually gives them the report and all of the data, and the FDA eventually does a raid, not on the office in India, but on the office in America. And I can tell you, when they have offices in America, there's absolutely typically nothing there, but the FDA raised them. They not only find the report that Kumar and Dinesh gave in India, but they find all of this falsified data. They even find a computer file that says, do not let the FDA see this. And so, you know, they slap all these fines on, you know, Ranbaxy. And then they eventually, what happens is there's a FDA office actually in India. But here's the very weird thing about it. It's not located near the actual Ranbaxy headquarters. And so typically what would happen is you would have FDA, when the FDA got ready to do an inspection, they would have to like signal the company Ranbaxy 2 weeks out. And not only signal them 2 weeks out, they would actually have to go about the process of scheduling an appointment, and then Ranbaxy would actually book their flight, book their hotel, get them lunch, and then give them a report, and then they would just walk away. That's typically how it happened. But they had recently recruited a guy by the name of Peter Baker. He was their investigator over there. He not only avoids all that process and says, I don't need any lunch, I don't need a hotel, I just need to see the data. And not only does he ask to see the data, but he wants to see their computers. And so he goes into the computers and he discovers that all of this falsified data inside of the computers. And so once he discovers all this falsified data, he then sends it back to the FDA. And then at that point, the FDA actually, to his knowledge, does absolutely nothing. So he eventually leaves the FDA. And not only on top of him visiting Ranbaxy, but he visited 80 other companies or drug companies to do inspections, both in India and China. And he said that between the 80 companies, 80% of them had falsified data. And so that kind of gives you a scope of how bad and why what I've experienced as a pharmacist. A lot of patients who would come back when I worked as a pharmacist, they'll say, hey, the generic isn't working the same, which is really unusual because Dinesh Thakur, who worked for the company when he moved to India, he gave his child an antibiotic for an infection, and the child was on an antibiotic forever. It never worked. Switched the child to a GlaxoSmithKline antibiotic, and then it worked, got rid of the infection. So he knew that the drugs they were making actually, not only did they not work, but they were actually contaminated, right? And on top of that, they also discovered that not only were they falsifying patient data, not only were they falsifying blood work, but they were falsifying reports on doing things like, for instance, you have to check the stability of drugs, right? And you check the stability by putting it inside of, let's say, high temperatures, so it can last in a Middle Eastern country. So you can check it over the course of months to see how long it'll last, okay? But you also can check that in cold temperatures, where they discovered that when they were doing those temperature checks on drugs, they were doing them over the course of 24 hours when you're supposed to do something like that for maybe six to 8 months or 3 months. Understand? So you can kind of get a scope of not only how dangerous, you know, it is for companies to be falsifying data, but how sometimes the studies don't actually always add up. And so to give you a scope on what impact this has, not only on generic drugs, but on brand drugs too. Think about this. 80% of the active ingredients, both for brand and generic, come from overseas, okay? So that's generic and brand, 80% of them. 90% of our drug supply today is actually generic drugs. So 90% of the drugs that you see today are actually generics. So keep that in mind. And 40% of them actually come from India today, okay? And on top of that, think about it like this. virtually none of our antibiotics actually come from America. They're all made overseas. So virtually none of them. Most of them are made in India and China, okay? And so when you get that scope of what our American drug supply is like today, because again, you have to think about this. That raid that they did on Ranbaxy, it happened in 2005, okay? But Ranbaxy came out with the generic Lipitor or atorvastatin in 2011. So we're talking 6 years later after the raid, after they discover all this falsified data, that in 2011, they showed that, you know, they were still putting drugs out there. They put the first generic Lipitor out. And so that gives you a scope of, and made $600 million in 6 months off of that drug. So it kind of gives you a scope of where we're at in our drug supply. And so I hope this video is really helpful for you guys. If you enjoy this information, please like, subscribe, and share below.